So we can begin today's Brown Bag seminar, which is at the same time the last one of this semester, which is ending. I would like to welcome you all to today's talk by Danilo Šarenac, who is a visiting fellow at the moment at the Center for Southeast European Studies. He is otherwise a senior research fellow at the Institute of Contemporary History in Serbia. He's been extensively working on the history both of World War I in the Balkans, as well as the interwar period of Yugoslavia. He's been working on banditry and the war itself. And today's talk will be less focusing on the history of the First World War and more on the historiography of the First World War, or rather the commemorations at the centenary of the anniversary in Serbia in particular, and how this was a part of the public debates and discussions and the controversy surrounding it. So I'm very glad that Danilo is joining us today. He joined us a few years ago for a conference in Graz on that topic. And so we're glad to see him back and looking forward to your talk. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be part of the Brown Bag seminar and your institute and to be here in Graz. As Florian has mentioned, this is a topic related to commemorations, but also I would like to see it as some kind of applied history. It is also in a way a personal story. We could discuss it this way, as I was also part of this process, and it puts me as a historian in a bit extraordinary position. So I will start with one recollection. When all this, I would like to say, paranoia or hysteria was unleashed in Serbia in 2013 and lasted basically well until 2017. I tried to remember when did I hear for the first time this kind of accusation that Serbia was to be blamed for the outbreak of the war, and this kind of uncomfortable position that you were actually the member of the state which has caused this massive havoc, or you have to discuss it, was it Serbia to be blamed or not. So I remembered it was actually, I don't know, do you know the series Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, which were aired in 92, 93, just in the middle of the Yugoslav wars. And there is episode 4, you can see it in YouTube, when young Indiana Jones visits Verdun. And there the soldiers explain to him why the war started and who is to be blamed. They put it in very simplified terms, but eventually the conclusion of young Indiana is actually we are fighting because of this small little country that nobody has heard of. It's called Serbia. So I remember the strange feeling, because it was something different that we learned in school, and how come suddenly there is no imperialism, there is no arms race, all these major strategic causes are not there. So this was just a small hint of what was about to happen. So I knew there were discussions in 1924, 1928. So this kind of war guilt question was always there, but the degree of explosion that happened in Serbia in 2014, I didn't really expect. So what actually happened was, as soon as the Serbian public heard, there were a couple of books published in early 2012, 2013, which placed Serbia in the center of the analysis, or at least somewhere around the center, and which were quite critical towards certain aspects of Serbia's past. Basically, a certain form of national mobilization ensued in Serbia. So basically, the focal point was the book of Christopher Clark, The Sleepwalkers, as he portrayed in a very critical way the May coup of 1903, the Sarajevo assassination, the rule of Apis, and all this kind of Serbian side of the story. And he made direct references to the latest violence in the Balkans in the 90s, as he mentioned the very loaded word, the term Srebrenica, and all that it implies. So basically what happened in Serbia was that all major mainstream historians, not only from the Great War field, but basically dealing with the history of Yugoslavia or modern history or even 19th century, they place their views in public, and we could hear that, as for example, late Professor Dusan Batakovic said, we actually see this revision and we understand it as a new declaration of war. So it was very, very strong reaction in Serbia. What is interesting is we need to say that basically at that point, almost nobody had the book of Christopher Clark in its hands. So it was all based on certain excerpts derived from immigration, from people who traveled, who read international reviews, but only a few people.
Seems like we have a technical issue. Sorry, Danilo, there was a brief interruption. We missed maybe the last 10 seconds or something like that.
Sorry.
So you were talking about the lack of knowledge about the book itself and, and the way in which it was indirectly received through reviews and so on in Serbia.
I understand. Okay. So only a minor publishing house, which was located outside of Belgrade, published the book, and it was basically not even covered in media. So the term revision made headlines. Basically, I knew when I spoke with taxi drivers or my neighbors or people who never actually read any book about history or historiography, they knew who was Christopher Clark, and that he was actually the biggest enemy of Serbia at that point. So we could hear also these kind of various conspiracy theories that major Western historians are actually on paychecks from secret services and so on. And all this was elaborated in a very neat way, for example, linking Austrian or German interwar historical fighting against Yugoslavia with modern day books that were published. So it was a very selective but very powerful narrative, which was very cohesive. So the utmost aim of this revision was to blame Serbia and to some extent Russia for the outbreak of the war. And basically it was all related to the latest violence, where Serbs were to be blamed as some kind of constant disruptors of European peace. So they did it in 1903 when they massacred Tom King. They did it in 1914, then again 1991. All this was basically creating immense psychological burden, and it was related very much with interpretation of the latest wars. So the thing that actually Christopher Clark actually made reference direct to Srebrenica made this very corpus delicti in a way. So basically nobody desired to make any evidences further about this. And then Margaret Macmillan published her book, and she was quoted very much for referencing to young Bosnia as Al-Qaeda and also mentioning Gavrilo Princip as terrorists. So all these things were quite sufficient for many to disseminate this kind of interpretation. So also one of the aims of this alleged revision was to basically prepare the European public for the relativization of the Second World War results. So very ambitious aim, and I think very, very unlikely. But simply, I have outlined the core of this kind of a situation. And what I'm trying to do is, firstly, I have to cover the entire literature that was published during this period abroad, as I have noticed that we saw this, as has mentioned, indirect references to certain books. So basically people did not read these authors, but they made references to them, claiming that basically they said this and that about Serbia. Although if you see, for example, some other books, especially published in Austria, they were quite critical about the German and Austrian side, actually praising the behavior of Serbia and so on. But these books were not presented very much in Serbia. Even if they were translated, they did not get certain attention that they deserved. So the narrative about revision remained there. And also, I would like to mention the Serbian approach to commemorations was also filled with this notion of revision. For example, Tomislav Nikolic, the president of Serbia at that time, was to be a ceremony figure on various European commemorations. And he, for example, referenced often to revision, that Serbia will not past is revised. Also, Ivica Dačić, who is still Actually, he was at that time Minister of Foreign Affairs. He said that we will not allow that Serbs are declared as culprits for all the violence and so on. So basically, we have statements of all major scientists, all major intellectuals, and basically all relevant politicians on power and in opposition. So it's a very important material which can be analyzed, these kind of rhetorics and narratives. So we see that this revision word was spread all over the place. And it is important that, to mention the book of Mile Bilajac, a distinguished Serbian historian, who actually summed up all these theories and published a book, which now had the second edition and it was translated into Russian, which is a very interesting book, but I disagree with many things in it. And it inspired my title in a way, as he said, why revision? And I would like in a way to say why paranoia, because I completely believe in the opposite understanding of contemporary issues. So if we expect that the centenary will be covered in a way by new approaches, methodological approaches, new themes, I think we were surprised all over Europe that actually the war guilt issue was so much important to many. We had scandals, for example, between Germany and UK, when Germany sent special envoy advising the UK Centenary Committee how they should perhaps a bit decrease their celebratory or victorious approach to the war, which was a bit a small scandal, but this was the maximum of it. What happened in the Balkans was actually that it really was quite serious and on the edge of certain diplomacy scandal. I should also mention a couple of examples that Tomislav Nikolic, the Serbian president, declined to participate on several events, as Kosovo was invited as well. So all these kind of contemporary problems actually cut the possibilities for Serbian delegations in many levels. It was similar in Sarajevo in 2014, when the Serbian delegation declined the official invitation to participate at the European-wide ceremony, as they quoted there is an anti-Serb inscription on the Sarajevo assembly. So all these problems from the 90s were quite there, and of course the name of Gavrilo Princip is related to all these themes, but simply I think it would be much different, of course, without the latest violence and struggles for interpretation. So the very important word for my work, and I hope future short monography on this topic, is the word revision. So it is understood in quite negative terms. So revision is something related to the revision of knowledge related to the Second World War. We always mention this word, especially in the former Yugoslavia, as certain values of Tito's partisans or Yugoslav anti-fascist struggles are actually decreased or completely abandoned. We call this revision, as some old values or some kind of reinterpretations are actually gaining momentum. However, revision is also something positive in science, and I was surprised that many of my colleagues did not understand the word in this section. As one great historian said, basically the eruption of the Great War is one of the most difficult questions in science, and it is, I believe, quite normal that we have these kind of shifts, and they do not have to be politically so directly implied, and especially not to put Serbia in such an important focus regarding its consequences. I'm now trying to develop this term and to find various interpretations about it. I would also like to mention one catchy quote that actually encapsulates this kind of problem. When Jay Winter, famous World War historian, was asked about this furious Serbian reaction about Christopher Clark's book, he said, well, if Serbia has some problems, it's their own problem. So this is very interesting, as it actually throws the ball into the Serbian courtyard, and I think that's a right approach, because why do you actually have the problem with this book, and why do you have so high emotions about this book? So I think this is a very important question we need to answer, and I would like to offer some kind of explanations. So my thesis is, in a way, that all this speaks a lot about certain uncertainties about Serbian national identity in post-Yugoslav context, as basically already in the 1920s, 30s, the Great War was seen as one of the founding stones of Serbian national identity. And especially after 1945, it was some kind of a subculture, and it all exploded in 1991. So it is now the basically core of the Serbian national identity, and any kind of, let's say, not such a subtle critique is seen as a very dangerous attack on Serbian national identity. And the second thesis is actually that it is most directly related to the interpretation of 1991-1999 wars, as Serbia is seen by a major part of the international community as the main culprit for the processes which were unleashed, and that the Serbs, as the most numerous nation in former Yugoslavia, actually have most blame for the events which took place. So all these actually processes coincided, and that's why this situation became so explosive. So I intend to see the literature. Of course, I mentioned numerous of press reports and articles and other material, TV shows that were actually used for dissemination of these theories. We saw major Serbian historians appearing on very, how should I say, controversial televisions in Serbia, where they were explaining in detail, in quite loose terms, alleged conspiracy theories against Serbia. So it was a very, very serious problem. And I like the book of Elliot Bernstein, who actually mentions this conspiracy theories approach and elaborated quite further about this. He named his book Plots Against Russia, which is also similar in a way that you feel as an island which is constantly under attack by various theories, and you see basically the attack coming from various teams. So some friends criticize me for using the term paranoia, that it is actually too strong, but I believe actually that really is the proper term, as these media presentations of my colleagues were quite serious, and I think they had provoked serious consequences for people who are not really able to cover what is happening in the international literature and so on. So I think it is such a strong term is actually quite necessary to be used in this situation. So to conclude, we could say that at this point, the major impression of Serbian, let's say, public is that Serbia was able to defend itself from this attack of revision. For example, Christopher Clark decided to edit a certain date in his book. For example, Gavrilo Princip was not a called terrorist, but a revolutionary, which, for example, I see as a good self-critique by the author, but in Serbia, mostly it was seen as a kind of a consequence of the Serbian pressure, and it actually, all this fighting actually was worth fighting for. So it is still, I think, very, very dubious how this centenary fight was interpreted. So I think we can perhaps stop at this point, and I hope that you will feel free to ask questions in various directions, and I will be able to add more details to questions. Maybe just to add briefly that what is interesting is that Serbian Centenary Committee, for example, in the same time was not actually working at all. That Serbian institutions that dealt with centenary were paralyzed by numerous elections and so on. So these kind of internal developments were, in my view, the bigger problem for commemorations and their activities than this alleged international attack and conspiracy. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Danilo. So for giving us this insight into these controversies and their political use in many ways. So I'll open the floor to questions. Maybe while everybody is slowly gathering their thoughts on this. I mean, my question is, I mean, it's maybe no surprise that politicians use historical events and commemorations, which happens frequently. I think what is interesting is to see that, how do you see what is the role of historians, of fellow historians? Why? Because I mean, World War I is not traditionally the most controversial aspect of Serbian history, the one which has been controversial in terms of domestic debates, but also one which maybe, especially national historians with a strong kind of nationalist preconception, have been focusing on. I mean, the main focus is World War II, let's say, the rehabilitation of the Chetnik movement, also controversies of the communist period, maybe the Ottoman period. But so what explains that historians of World War I or historians more broadly were, as you arguing, kind of participants in this, and in a certain way increasing this rather than kind of correcting it and saying, well, in fact, we might not agree with Clark, but it's not a conspiracy. So how do you interpret this?
Well, I think that the Gavrilo Princip and this kind of Bosnian part of the story is very important, because we already his name was misused in the Second World War. Let's say the Kingdom of Yugoslavia had a very, how should I say, very careful attitude towards Gavrilo Princip. He didn't have a memorial. He didn't have anything in Belgrade, for example. And there was always debate, how should this be handled, because it was sensitive and there were certain attacks. And there were people who were saying that, okay, we created Yugoslavia, we can now do whatever we want. And then they would see these kind of attacks from international public, and then Serbian politicians had to react and say, you cannot say that we organized our association, that's really harmful, that's not correct, and so on. But we see that it was a topic, but not this kind of topic. And in the Second World War, we have Chetnik units named Gavrilo Princip, which was really a transformation of this kind of name, because he declares to be a Yugoslav in his trial and so on. So we have this kind of term getting more and more loaded. And after everything that happened in Sarajevo in the war of 1990s, I think it was really his name that this was directly linked to interpretation of both events. So we're speaking about Yugoslavia, its creation and its fall. So basically, the World War had this kind of a segment which is completely neglected in today's Serbia. For example, Yugoslavia was not even mentioned once during commemoration. That did not exist. Now the official interpretation is it was Serbia's defense war, Serbia managed to liberate its territory and so on. So Yugoslavia, nowhere to be found. And so I think that Gavrilo Princip actually has this kind of emotions that it links the story to Yugoslavia and to Bosnia, which is directly related, of course, to the violence, which was perhaps the worst taking place in Yugoslavia, and to the 1990s, where actually who is to be blamed for destroying Yugoslavia. And actually, the worst crisis we're seeing in Bosnia, as we had these kind of double celebrations or anniversaries that Emir Kusturica was having his own commemorations in Visegrad and the Sarajevo government in Sarajevo. So basically, Bosnia was really the battlefield in this sense, and Serbia was supporting the Banja Luka approach in this sense. So I think basically this very beginning of the war connects the 1914 and 1991 very directly.
Thank you. Igor, you have a question. Go ahead.
Yes, you mentioned Indiana Jones. And so how do you find the influence in this historiography in the public sphere now of the pop culture? It's not just Indiana Jones, but now we saw the King's Men and the murder, the assassination of Ferdinand in Sarajevo. And do you think that now we can find that actually Miss Latinovic, the late historian from Serbia, was really right about all this, about the First World War, and later the film The Genocide, and how this genocide was used in the pop culture? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Should we get several questions, Danilo, or would you like to have?
Okay, that's what.
So we can have
several questions.
Yes, Anna, go ahead. Anna David. Anna, go ahead.
Hello. I apologize. I missed the first 8 minutes of the presentation. Had some problems with internet, so I hope I'm not asking something that hasn't been touched in the beginning. On thank you, Danilo, for this just the tip of the iceberg or the tip of the volcano. So I have a couple of questions. My first question is the impact of these debates on the official interpretations of the First World War as they find their way into the educational system and onto the level of official, the politics of cultural policy. So first of all, I'd like to ask you to what extent these interpretations of the First World War and in relation, whether you would say that, in relation to that, the Balkan Wars have entered school books already prior to these debates that preceded the celebration of the end of the First World War and also the beginning of the First World War. So to what extent, how do you interpret this parallel ways in which these debates, because if you're speaking about the debates among historians, this can always acquire, as you yourself mentioned, some characteristic of controversies, and then you don't know really in the end what is the winning, who is the winner. But when you're looking at the contents of the school books, then you definitely are speaking about the winners, because it's the ministry which decides about the contents of textbooks. So to what extent you would make this, so what would be your observation on the relationship between the controversies and the winners that are to be observed in school textbooks? And in relation to that, also the impact on the official culture, for example, the case of the so-called rejoining or adjoining of Vojvodina, where we had quite a series of events around the time of these anniversaries. And I think it is also clearly there is a connection between the events starting from the late 80s and the gradual and unceasing disputes over the extent to which the autonomy of Vojvodina should be disputed. So just for those who are not familiar, in the past several years, there has been a new museum of adjoining, not annexation, but re-adjoining or adjoining of Vojvodina. There has been a new museum space open for that, even something that existed prior to that between the archive of Vojvodina and the Museum of Vojvodina that was, well, sort of an unkept little park. Now it is the park of re-adjoinment. And there is also a new monument to King Peter I that is standing quite curiously at the place of the former local bus station and fruit and vegetable market. So that is quite curious. My last question is about how indeed you would compare these debates and some consensus. I would say that there is a consensus about First World War in a post-socialist state such as Serbia to Russia, where World War II is an absolute winner and an untouchable cult in contemporary Russia. Obviously, the October Revolution is skipped. It doesn't exist in any form of celebration. The imperial past is selectively extolled. So how would you make this comparison with the fact that in Serbia, the Second World War, where Serbia as part of Yugoslavia was on the winning side, is completely debunked?
Thanks, Anna. So I think we take those two questions. First one about the role of pop culture, I guess, and the second one about history textbooks, as well as the particular position of Vojvodina in the kind of aftermath of World War I. So Danilo, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah. Okay, I'll try to be brief. Well, pop culture, actually this centenary showed how important this pop culture is. For example, several movies were made in Serbia about this. And one director, he summed it up very interestingly. He said there is a capacity to reform Serbian nationalism with this kind of remembrance of the Great War. So we'll infuse our romanticism, which is now present after the 90s, with patriotism of the Great War. So how powerful actually the movies can be in the sense. And only to quote on one other French historian who said that actually many things we find out actually about other countries and their past, we actually find out from films. We do not read books. So this immense influence, and I think that will always be some kind of trace to Serbia and Gavrilo Princip and assassination. And whenever somebody meets you in a foreign country, he might refer instantly to Gavrilo Princip because he saw some movie and so on. So I think this is something that we need to get used to it and not take it so emotionally. So definitely there is a number of movies. Some are better, some not so good. But basically, I think again we deal with historiography and we can try to influence pop culture in this sense, but I think it's a sphere of its own and definitely has its own regulations and interferes with our work in many sense. So about the official narrative and its influence, I think we are, my director, Predrag Marković, likes to say as some kind of part joke, part serious statement that we are the institute, are the masters of the narrative in a sense in Serbia, which is partly correct, but as soon as you touch the curriculum, you are no one. So at first, 10 years ago, I thought I will write textbooks, and then I understood the process that actually there is this agreement that ministry has to give, which you will never get if you said certain things about certain topics. So basically it's a closed system directly linked to politics and has nothing to do with our own international domestic historical debates. So we are not even close of touching curriculum or anything. It's basically a still stable version where you go the main battles, the main results, few pictures of main Serbian voivodas from the field marshals from the Great War, and that's it. So we are quite standardized. It is sufficient to say that even when you study history in Belgrade, the history of Yugoslavia, you will not even get a single question at your exam about history of the Great War. That's seen as something that everybody knows. Basically, you have to study this. This is the current state. So it is the same in textbooks. So Vojvodina, this is very interesting. Vojvodina replaced Yugoslavia in this narrative, and I was really struck by this development. The unification, or how to put it precisely, the term in English, what happened in Vojvodina was really put in the focus in 2018. One section of Vojvodina Museum was actually cleared so that a new museum of rejoining or joining was, I don't know, what was the term you mentioned? It was,
there is no official term. I translated as adjoining or rejoining, but I have not seen an official term, because присоединение in the contemporary Serbia is an archaic word. So in fact, we do not have too many etymological agreements on that either, but it was carefully chosen.
Yes.
The reason for the archaism. But I'd say adjoining.
So definitely Yugoslavia was declared as a mistake and it should not be mentioned. And I carefully followed what was happening with this term, and only the Museum of History Yugoslavia organized a series of lectures and debates about the Yugoslav topic. So Vojvodina was actually to be the single territorial profit or success of Serbia in the Great War, and it was seen as such in this context. So it was completely reframed, which was very, very interesting. And with Russia, that is also very interesting, because also I met some Russian, for example, doctors in Serbia, and I was amazed as they had a very critical view of Serbia's role in the Great War. And I was surprised, and I asked further about these arguments, and it is quite popular in certain circles in Russia to say that actually Serbia was to be blamed for the disappearance of the Russian Empire. So it is very interesting. So Serbia was pushed in a way by two sides now. So I actually started to research this topic, and I found out that actually Alexander Solzhenitsyn was the key, how should I say, inventor or in modern times of this kind of narrative, and he mentions this in several of his books, and that was really something that really turned this idea into motion. So basically a special article can be written about this kind of criticism that Serbia was in a way tricked somehow Russia into war as an ally and actually provoked all these events. So it is very interesting. People in Serbia mostly don't know this, but I actually started to put some things on paper, and it's quite widespread in Russian intelligentsia.
Great, thank you. We have two further questions, one by Anna and then Milos. Maybe we can take those two. Yes, Anna, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, thanks for your presentation. I think I'll kind of continue in line with previous Anna's questions and ask some things about these commemoration practices and rituals that kind of were installed regarding this, the First World War, especially this Natalia's Raimonda symbol that was kind of introduced, I don't know, like 15 years ago or something like that. And also this присоединение, joining in a sense of what is the, of constructing new symbols, new words even, or taking them from the previous archaic dictionaries. And my question is, what is the stand of historians, or were there debate among historians about these commemorative practices and new symbols? And another thing is also how this First World War commemoration was kind of incorporated in the grand narrative of liberation wars. And what is the stand of like liberation wars, where also the Second World War and the wars from the 1990s are introduced in this official historical narrative of Serbia. Thanks.
Thanks, Anna. Milos, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, Danilo, long time no see. Thank you for your talk. So I raised my question and a comment almost as someone who participated in this. As far as I know, I was the first one to write a review of Christopher Clark's book in Serbia. So way before the thing was taken over by media and by politicians. And when I think about that time, I mean, I don't think the reason why I did that was I felt in a way insecure about identity or about the heritage of the 1990s or the war crimes. But in a way, I think that listening to your talk, I think there is some uniqueness about Serbia and the First World War, and I don't think that's the case. So for instance, I was in Berlin on a ceremony about First World War in 2014. And that time, the German president was Frank-Walter Steinmeier. And it was like a youth gathering. And he told us, members of various European countries, read Christopher Clark's book. It's very good. So Clark was really vilified in Serbia by people who, as you said, have read his book. But also the popularity in Germany is also quite telling. And I mean, like afterwards, the book was published in countless editions. He edited a Netflix TV show about German history. And also, I do think he's a very controversial figure, because after the whole controversy died down, it was discovered that he was paid by the Hohenzollern family to write a report in their legal case against German state to regain their properties. So in a way, for me, it's, I don't know, for me, you lose kind of a lot of prestige as a historian if you're ready to accept that kind of an offer. I mean, there is a very interesting piece by LSE historian David Motadell in New York Review of Books about the whole affair. So my question for you would be, do you think that, in a way, let's say it's just a comment. I think that there is some kind of a uniqueness in your talk about Serbia, where I don't think it was the only place where it seemed that First World War still had a huge contemporary political relevance. Thank you.
Thanks, Milos. So, Danilo, I would give the floor back to you to address those two comments and questions.
Well, about new rituals, I actually like the introduction of Natalia Raimonda, flower and all this story. In a way, it is certain copycat of the British case, but I think it was a very original solution. So I, for example, listened to Professor Dubravka Stojanović, who criticized this idea. So I looked in a bit about this flower, and it is actually quite special for the Balkans. It only grows around Niš, South Serbia, and actually on the Macedonian-Greece border, where it was the line of Salonika front. So it is very well chosen. So this flower is supposedly dead, and when you put more water, it grows again. So it's a very symbolic, powerful story. And the wrap, which is actually placed on this image of a flower, is actually used from Albanian certificate, this famous medal that was issued to anyone who participated in the famous Albanian retreat. So actually all this symbolics, I think, well adapted and suited. It basically did the single thing that I liked from this official approach. So it was introduced in 2012. So now it already is in a way accepted in this sense. But when we speak about this grand liberation narrative, I think this is now cut in a way. In the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, it was used as a grand narrative 1912, 1918, but now as we have this story with Kosovo, we basically do not refer to it as before. And I hear more and more my colleagues mentioning the symptom 7-year fighting, which is more neutral, and it actually does not mention liberation and those things. And to mention the Second World War together with this is really unthinkable, as we speak about completely different processes, and it is even more difficult to say who liberated who and so on, and we will completely be stuck into this story. What was also that you mentioned, I think I mentioned the question, and about Miloš, your comment, I'm glad to see you too. I know that there were, as one German colleague said, funny reactions in Germany to this book, and I think this is normal. And definitely the career of Christopher Clark skyrocketed in many senses. He became a phenomenon in history. I don't think anybody in our lifetime got so many honors and so on. It definitely speaks about certain shifts European-wide. But I didn't see anything like this in Serbia happening in any other country. I would like to hear about other cases that we actually had all the governments saying things about one book and claiming this is a conspiracy against Serbian people and so on. So I think that this is really something unique in this sense, because we had debates in UK, for example, was this related to Brexit and this British uniqueness, and you could find a dozen of these articles in British press. In France, there is this debate about forced mobilization or with consent and so on. And I'm aware that Maria Todorova cut in many aspects Christopher Clark books in pieces, but not for political terms, but for certain stereotypes and misquotes and stereotypes and so on. Also is the case with Hugh Strawn, who didn't like the book, and he's one of the greatest authority in the war, and he also stresses that it is important to honor those who were victorious in the war, as basically that war was not fought for nothing, as many think, but the world would be much a different place if Germany or Hungary won, so on. So there are these kind of debates, but this kind of language and this kind of mobilization and this kind of hostility, I'm not aware that anybody else actually used.
Thanks. I mean, maybe there's still some time for questions. Who would like to ask them just put up their hand? I mean, my point is actually, isn't there an interesting symmetry between the way Clark describes, the Serbian or the Bosnian episode of the war and the Serbian nationalist response to it? Because again, also he, I think, took it as Princip as an exclusively Serbian, and not as a Yugoslav. So in a certain way, he accepted the logic of erasing Yugoslavia and the goal of Yugoslavia among people like Princip from the story, which of course is the same, which then the nationalist in Serbia, the rhetoric was, well, he was maligned because he was a Serb, was fighting for Serbian goals. but the whole fact that there was actually the strong, Yugoslav movement. I mean, not just violent as in the case of Princip, but also otherwise is completely erased from that story in a certain way, both among Clark as well as among the kind of the response in Serbia you've talked about. So that I see a certain paradoxical symmetry of kind of normalizing this national. That this is the only framework in which people are committing, acts of violence is to establish nation states, not of multinational states.
Well, yes, definitely. Miloš's book was basically the only contribution of Serbian historiography to this understanding in a way, because we had Dedijer from the 60s, and Miloš was actually the only one who went to the archive to all these sources and actually wrote about political thinking of young Bosnia, which was, as we saw, much more complex than Clark described, or many people in Belgrade who actually didn't know much about young Bosnia but were eager to defend it. So definitely their ideas and what they read and what they were saying was something much more different than we could see on media.
So it's the classical phenomena, of course, of reading history backwards in many ways, which we often find is that. But I mean, now that the as you mentioned, the kind of the public controversies have ebbed away with the end of the commemoration. Interestingly enough, there was much less controversy about the end of the war. I mean, at the 100th anniversary of 1918 rather than 1914. So it's kind of interesting that seems to be less controversial, at least in the Serbian debate, or I think even in places like Croatia, there's been discussions about the impact and the books published about the impact of the dissolution of the Habsburg monarchy, but it's not a political controversy. So do you think, is this chapter just kind of an episode? How do you categorize it in retrospect, its impact more kind of long-term on historiography in Serbia and also in the other neighboring countries?
Well, there are definitely positive sides as well, because we heard so many nuanced views about Gavrilo Princip, and basically anybody who knew anything about him published something. So it's definitely, even people who were more left-wing defended him in a way for this kind of social rights approach and his right to be a revolutionary, that it's something not popular in modern world and so on. And we have this kind of right-wing defense that he was actually fighting for the oppressed Serbs and so on. So we got a really incredible amount of books. I think there was around 700 books published in Serbia for these 4 years, and it is incredible just to see. And I think most of them are actually new translations or new books of various quality. And when I'm trying to follow this, it is really difficult. So the production was immense as this mobilization got into motion, as Serbia allocated immense funds, officially 5 million euros for the Centenary just for the 1914. So when I found the budget law, and just to mention the United Kingdom allocated 10 times more for the entire commemorative process. So actually everything was printed. Whatever you had, you were able to print. So what will happen now, it is difficult to say, because all these things are still in the domain of historiography, and will they enter the narrative? I think it depends from politics. So some of these topics can provoke further controversies. For example, the issue of war losses, I think, is just waiting to be brought into public, as officially Serbia lost 1,200,000 soldiers, which basically not a single historian in Serbia who deals with the topic will actually confirm, as the losses are apparently half less, luckily. So when this comes into public, that will be a huge bomb in a sense. And so these topics can be brought public, and we will see which intensity and so on. But now things are, I think, quite calmed down in a sense, and I think the general impression is that this attack passed.
Thank you. Crisanto, you have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I hope I can ask this in a coherent way. But the kind of broader trend in Habsburg historiography before the centenary commemorations was kind of less prison of the people's kind of nationality focused approach, and more one that I would say is, I guess, sympathetic to the Habsburg bureaucracy and stuff like that. So how then, and then with the centenary, I remember reading some articles, not academic articles, but articles in the media about they were kind of, I guess, rehabilitating the Habsburg Empire, maybe as like kind of a precursor to the EU. I mean, I'm not going to comment on how much I agree with that kind of assessment, because whenever you get these kind of assessments that are in more public discourse, not so much academic, they tend to be kind of ham-fisted and not applied in the best way, in my opinion, even if there is some truth to them, I guess. And so my question is, how does this kind of narrative, I guess, how is that received in Serbia? And was there any kind of backlash against that, as there was for Christopher Clark's book? Thank you.
Well, definitely, as long as, well, as far as we're speaking about Bosnian wars, from the 90s, Bosnian War, we see this kind of rehabilitation of this Habsburg rule, basically seeing that, oh, you see what national states fall apart, so it was better when it was some kind of international rule or so on. So it's definitely simplification. And I also read, this was mentioned since the 90s very much, that basically there is this kind of trend that actually to speak about Habsburg as some kind of predecessor of the EU, which is of course very, very dangerous and I think fault. But that was mentioned in Serbia, this kind of revision narrative, as it was said that EU has to find somebody to blame outside of the EU for its own peace. So that was the sentence, that basically they will say any kind of supranational collaboration is better than national state. And even those who defended Gavrilo Princip from the leftist position, they will say basically the modern Europe does not accept revolutionaries in general. We're speaking about the globalized world and so on. So everybody who fights for its own rights is kind of outdated. So this is also in terms with this kind of Serbia as a culprit for destroying the Belle Epoque. So if you basically want to disregard all the faults of the Belle Epoque, of course.
I mean, I guess that raises the question raises an interesting observation also, whether to which degree Serbian historiography was also taken by surprise by kind of trends which had been on debates which had been ongoing earlier. I mean, I think what Crisanto is pointing, I mean, Peter Judson and other historians have been working on, reevaluating the Habsburg history. And again, they're not the ones who are saying the Habsburg everything is great, but moving away from the prisoner of peoples. And similarly, there's been historiography on the Ottoman period has been moving away from the Ottoman exclusively as the predatory Muslim empire, but one which is more nuanced. And so this is kind of the development, I would say, in the last 20 years of historiography, which has been reevaluating the multinational empire. So of course, as a result, World War I isn't this kind of logical. I mean, I think in the previous period we saw World War I as the logical step of a historical kind of evolution away from multinational states and empires to nation states, and that kind of assumption that this is a kind of the logical progression of history which is kind of the traditional nationalist point of view, has been challenged in historiography. And in a certain way, I felt some of the responses in Serbia in 2014 were, as if there was a surprise to discover that there is this historiographical debate going on outside of Serbia, which, of course, as a conclusion, does not see the end of these empires as inherently a liberation, which, of course, does not fit with the pre-communist and then partly the communist narrative, which, twisted it but adopted it essentially. So is that also a way to kind of understand what has been happening, that there was a certain way, kind of lack of awareness of kind of these larger historiographical debates, which are independently of Clark as an individual author, which I think I would agree with Milos that, the book is fantastically readable, but also is problematic when it comes to especially the Balkan section. But even independently of him, that there was a larger shift, which kind of seems to have been taken kind of some of the historians by surprise in Serbia.
Definitely, if you, for example, mentioned Fritz Fisher, who was seen as the key defender of the Serbian stance. So basically, Serbian historiography stood with Fritz Fisher. That was, although his views were also revised, and in a way he was modernized in many aspects, this kind of debate. So, for example, many historians, quite serious historians, would mention even the conclusions of the peace conference in 1919 as basically the definition of the status. Why should we discuss anything when it was formally diplomatically challenged? And I couldn't really comprehend this because I was speaking seriously about this. So basically, very, very interesting topics were, I think, raised with this controversy, because even the role of historian was discussed in very strange historian was somebody who should defend Serbia in this sense, and he should be doing this by publishing in English. So basically, the only thing is that they don't know what we think. So we should just tell them what we feel, and we should do it in English, well spoken English, and basically things will be settled. So it is very, very, I think definitely has to do with some basically decades spent in isolation of the entire science. And I think this has to do something with this, because I mean, we can speak about Clark's private jobs and offers and so on, and I think still that's something different, because definitely this kind of low, and this is not morally valid attack, I think, on his book, because certain professors were actually mentioning even in Serbia that through scholarship and stipends, the Germany or United States are shifting the narrative in Serbian science. So this is also certain, I think, attack. So you are not allowed to be a fellow anywhere else because you are basically directly mentioned to Secret Service. So I think this is not normal way to deal with it. And whatever was mentioned at the ceremony Miloš mentioned in Germany, I think it's still very mild and a gentle influence in this sense, which is always there. I'm completely aware that very, very funny things were mentioned in German public, and that many people were very thrilled. Of course, they didn't read the book because it was declared some kind of coffee table book, and it has almost 700 pages. So it's very serious work to read this book analytically. And at the time when I got to write a review of this book, that was in 2013, it was already flammable material. When I was given this book, they told me, could you please write this about this crazy professor, he attacked us and so on. So it was basically, I got this kind of input. It was not any book. So that I have to read it twice or something like that, that I have to think about every word and so on. So I think when Miloš was doing his great job, it was still different times.
Great. Well, thank you. I think we've reached the end of our time slot. Danilo, thank you so much for your presentation. Thanks to all of you for your questions, and we're looking forward to reading the summary of the conclusions which you're deriving at, and that's certainly an interesting contribution to the debate and questions of more widely historiography, not just about that of World War I in Serbia. So thank you very much. And with this, we're concluding our brown bag series for this semester, and we'll see each other again, hopefully partly live, partly online during the next semester. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you.